CHamoru self-determination, the idea that only the CHamoru people, the indigenous people of Guam, have the right to decide the political destiny for Guam in terms of decolonization, is today a cornerstone in CHamoru political thought. However, before the 1980s, such an idea was relatively new, misunderstood, and regarded as extremely radical. During the 1980s, no other CHamoru organization made a greater impact in raising awareness about CHamoru self-determination to the people of Guam and the international community than the CHamoru activist group OPI-R, also pronounced as OPI-R, the Organization of People for Indigenous Rights. They were the first CHamoru group to utilize the United Nations as an international forum to express their desire for CHamoru self-determination and decolonization, and they fundamentally influenced conversations and legislation concerning political status change for Guam. Guahusi Pulan, and we will explore OPI-R's fight for CHamoru self-determination. OPI-R's story begins after the 1979 referendum on Guam's constitution, where the resounding defeat of Guam's constitution made it abundantly clear that the political status question of Guam must be addressed before the drafting of a constitution. Guam leaders followed suit, proclaiming that the time has come for the people of Guam to choose their future political status. The Guam legislature passed Bill 417, and in May 1980, Governor Paul Calvo signed the bill into law as Public Law 15-128, creating the Commission on Self-Determination for the People of Guam. The usage of the term self-determination was a clear reference to the rights of self-determination as articulated by the United Nations. Public Law 15-128 noted that past attempts to change the status of Guam by means of constitutional conventions have failed because the views of the people of Guam were not sought prior to the initiation of such constitution. The new Commission on Self-Determination was tasked to ascertain the desire of the people of Guam as to their future political relationship with the United States of America. To accomplish this, the Commission established 5 task forces for the major political status options in order to conduct a public education campaign on the advantages and disadvantages associated with each status, as well as to educate Guam voters on the meaning of self-determination. After the education campaign, the Commission would then conduct a plebiscite to establish what political status the people of Guam desired, which Public Law 15-128 set the plebiscite for September 12, 1981. But due to delays and the immense workload, this date was later changed by Public Law 1634 to January 30th, 1982. It's important to note that the law made the plebiscite open to all eligible Guam residents. After determining what political status the people of Guam desired through the plebiscite results, the Commission would then represent the people of Guam in political status negotiations with the United States to attain Guam's desirous political status. However, throughout the Commission's education campaign, the sensitive question of who is the self and self-determination for Guam arose again and again. This was a crucial question to answer because determining who the self and self-determination was established who could be eligible to participate in the political status plebiscites. Public Law 15-128 made the plebiscite open to all eligible Guam voters. However, there were those who believed that the law should be changed so that the vote could be restricted to only CHaMorus. There were 2 sides to this issue, the CHamoru self-determination side and the all-people self-determination side, as I term it. The CHamoru self-determination side believed that the self in self-determination referred to the CHamoru people. Thus, only CHamoru should be able to participate in the plebiscite votes. They argued that self-determination as set forth by international law, according to Article 73 of the UN Charter and UN Resolution 1514, was a human right reserved for peoples of non-self-governing territories, understood as colonized peoples. They point out that the UN articulated the rights of self-determination as a mechanism for decolonization in order to resolve the historic and current wrongs of colonization through the non-self-governing territory or colony having a full measure of self-government. This is achieved through political status change to either free association, independence, integration with a sovereign state, or any political status freely chosen by the people. Since CHamoru's were the colonized people of Guam for about 300 years, first by Spain and now the US, therefore it was solely the CHamoru's who should make the decision about Guam's decolonization through an act of self-determination. To include everyone in the plebiscite is to deny CHamoru's their rights of self-determination, which they were historically denied under colonial powers. On the other side, the all-people self-determination side believed that self-determination belonged to all people on Guam. They argue that everyone in Guam, both CHamoru's and non-CHamoru's, called Guam their home, pay taxes, contribute, and have a personal stake in the island, and therefore all people on Guam should have the right to participate in the plebiscites. Another argument is that as U.S. citizens or residents in an American territory under American laws, everyone should have the equal right to vote in the plebiscites regardless of your race, ethnicity, and national origin, as American law dictates. This argument demonstrates the conflict between the American legal system and CHamoru self-determination. Furthermore, some of them claim that restricting the vote to only CHamoru's is racist and discriminatory, or that CHamoru's were too racially mixed with other peoples to be considered the true indigenous people of Guam. This passionate debate surrounding Guam's self-determination question was fueled by the significant demographic changes that occurred on the island after World War II. In 1940, Guam's indigenous population, the CHamoru's, constituted a supermajority of 91%. However, due to the United States' control over Guam's immigration policy, thousands of people were allowed to settle on Guam, and by 1980, the CHamoru population had decreased to less than half of the total population. This intense shift occurred without the consent or choice of the CHamoru's themselves. For the first time in the island's history, non-CHamoru civilian residents outnumbered CHamoru civilian residents, and many non-CHamoru's desired a say in the future political status of Guam. This demographic transformation sets Guam apart from many other colonies where defining the self and self-determination was not controversial. Unlike Guam, these colonies did not experience significant immigration, allowing their indigenous populations to maintain supermajorities. The influence of small migrant populations in these colonies had minimal impact on their decolonization processes. However, the circumstances in Guam, with its rapid demographic changes, contributed to the heated discussions and debate surrounding the meaning of the self and self-determination for the island. It was during this time, with the upcoming plebiscite, that in 1981, a new vocal CHamoru rights group came into existence. This new group was the Organization of People for Indigenous Rights, better known as OPI-R. The acronym OPI was a play on words, as it sounded like the CHamoru word OP, which means to respond. OPI-R brought together many members of earlier activist organizations of Parapanda, the Guam landowners movement, as well as other individuals who were not necessarily affiliated with these organizations. Members included Robert Underwood, Narissa Britannia Underwood, Bernadita Camacho Dunca, Hope Alvarez Cristobal, Benjamin J.F. Cruz, Clotilde Ding Good, Silas Ed Good, Phil Gutierrez, Chris Paris Howard, Anthony Tony Leon Guerrero, Laura Sauder, Alejandro Al Lizama, Sherry Lizama, Rosa Salas Palomo, Ronald Franquist Tihan, Maria Constantino Tihan, Mariano Santos, Bernice Santos, Ron Rivera, among many more. The members came from a wide range of professional and life experiences as well as ethnic backgrounds. The one issue that united all these diverse individuals into OPI-R was the issue of CHamoru self-determination. To quote an OPI-R paper, "On one issue, we are strongly united. We firmly believe that only the CHamoru people, the native people of Guam, have the right to alter Guam's status from a non-self-governing territory to one considered as having a full measure of self-government." OPI-R's stance was clear. They argued that the right to vote in a plebiscite to determine Guam's future political status does not belong to all people residing on Guam. Rather, that right belongs solely to the indigenous people of Guam, the CHaMorus and their descendants. By taking this CHamoru self-determination position, members of OPI-R would encounter intense criticism from the sizable pro-American community who viewed them as being racist and anti-American. OPI-R did not campaign for a particular political status in the upcoming plebiscite. Instead, OPI-R embarked on its own campaign to educate the people on the rights of CHamoru self-determination and lobbied the legislature to amend the plebiscite process to recognize that it was only the CHamoru people who had the right to vote on Guam's political status because the plebiscite was open to all eligible Guam voters. OPI-R presented two options to ensure an only CHamoru vote. The first option proposed limiting the vote to individuals who were residents of Guam in 1898 and their descendants. The selection of 1898 was based on the historical event when the United States seized Guam from Spain and the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The second option restricted the vote to individuals who were residents of Guam in 1946 and their descendants. The rationale behind choosing 1946 was that it marked the signing of the United Nations Charter, which outlined the rights of non-self-governing territories. Additionally, in 1946, the United States voluntarily included Guam on the list of non-self-governing territories. In pursuance of this goal, OPI-R participated in public debates, organized public rallies in support of CHamoru self-determination, released advertisements, sent petitions to the legislature. OPI-R members attended nearly every Commission on Self-Determination meeting, and as a result of their efforts in 1981, the Commission of Self-Determination recommended to the legislature that the rights of the CHamoru people to self-determination be addressed and carried out. However, the legislature did not act upon this. Nevertheless, OPI-R persisted. In an effort to bring international attention to the issue, OPI-R began corresponding with the United Nations and with the UN Committee on Decolonization in particular. Ironically, CHaMorus learned and gained interest in the UN when the US invited the UN Decolonization Committee to oversee the 1979 constitutional referendum. It was believed that this was not motivated by sincere U.S. efforts to decolonize Guam, but rather an attempt to legitimize the constitutional referendum as an act of self-determination and thus removal of Guam from the UN list of non-self-governing territories. This precedence was established with Puerto Rico as they were delisted from the UN list of non-self-governing territories after drafting their own federally authorized constitution. The U.S. exerted pressure on Guam leaders, discouraging them from participating in the UN process. During a visit to Guam, Interior Deputy Assistant Secretary Pedro San Juan cautioned Guam leaders against pursuing the UN process. Additionally, Harvey Feldman, the alternative U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, told the Commission on Self-Determination that if Guam engaged in the United Nations process, the U.S. would refuse to negotiate any political status change with Guam. While these threats and warnings halted the Commission from engaging with the United Nations, however, non-governmental groups such as OPI-R found Washington's threats and warnings to be more of a reason to go to the UN, prompting them to continue their engagement with the UN. As the approaching dates of the plebiscite on January 30th, 1982 drew near, OPI-R stepped up efforts to limit the vote to only CHamoru's. Their efforts led to the Commission on Self-Determination proposing a CHamoru self-determination bill which would restrict voting to residents who became U.S. citizens by virtue of Guam's 1950 Organic Act. However, OPI-R wasn't entirely supportive of the bill, as the group desired the vote to be limited to residents of Guam in 1946 and their descendants, which was connected to the signing of the UN Charter that gave the right to self-determination for Guam. OPI-R criticized the bill for connecting the right of self-determination to the 1950 Organic Act rather than the UN Charter. Despite OPI-R's criticism, they were pragmatic and ended up supporting the CHamoru self-determination bill, but with, of course, a preference for the 1946 vote limitation. If the legislature failed to pass a CHamoru self-determination bill, OPI-R planned to march to the governor's house to request a special session of the legislature to support CHamoru self-determination. On January 14th, there was a public hearing for the CHamoru self-determination bill as well as two other bills related to the plebiscite. In a hearing that lasted far into the night, people testifying in favor of the CHamoru self-determination bill received thunderous cheers from the nearly 100 supporters in the building. They emphasized that the bill would be recognizing the rights of the CHamoru people to finally decide their political fate, which they long had been denied. However, not everyone testified in support of the CHamoru self-determination bill. One detractor wearing a red and blue shirt emblazoned with USA testified against the bill, declaring that it violated the sacred Bill of Rights. Another detractor characterized OPI-R and the indigenous rights movement as a radical minority of unpatriotic anti-government misfits, totally unrepresentative of island residents, and described the UN as so infected with communists and pro-communist nations that it presents a grave threat to world freedom. After the eventful public hearing, OPI-R members felt optimistic that the legislature would pass the CHamoru self-determination bill, leading them to cancel the planned march on the governor's house. Unfortunately, their optimism was short-lived, as on January 19th, the CHamoru self-determination bill died in the Criminal Justice Committee just 11 days before the plebiscite. Subsequent attempts to bring it to the floor of the legislature the next day failed due to a lack of support from the legislature, who felt the issue was too controversial to publicly support. As OPI-R was unable to persuade the legislature to restrict the vote to only CHamoru's in the upcoming plebiscite, they pursued a multifaceted approach to halt the plebiscite. This included legal action, petitioning the public, and the United Nations. On January 26, 1982, OPI-R member attorney Benjamin J. Cruz, along with attorney Frank Lujan, petitioned the U.S. District Court of Guam to halt the upcoming plebiscite scheduled for January 30th. Their petition argued that the Guam legislature had exceeded its delegated powers by passing the plebiscite bill without authorization from the U.S. Congress. However, Judge John P. Raker dismissed the petition for lack of jurisdiction. 2 days later, Cruz filed two suits in the Superior Court of Guam, seeking a court order to halt the plebiscite. The first suit was filed on behalf of OPI-R, reiterating the argument that the Guam legislature exceeded its delegated power, identical to the previous district court suits. The second suit was filed by Cruz on his own behalf, arguing that the plebiscite would involve an illegal expenditure of taxpayers' money. In less than 2 hours after the filing, Judge Ramon V. Diaz dismissed both suits. During the same week, OPI-R also circulated a petition requesting Guam's village commissioners to assist in getting the votes delayed until the right to self-determination was recognized. 18 of the island's 19 commissioners, now called mayors, signed the petition. The day before the plebiscite, OPI-R sent representatives to the United Nations regional office in Japan. They presented a petition expressing their protests against the upcoming vote, arguing that it failed to recognize CHamoru's self-determination. Despite OPI-R's efforts, the plebiscite proceeded as scheduled on January 30th. The results of the vote showed that Commonwealth status received the highest amounts of votes, with statehood getting second place. However, since none of the political status options received the majority votes required, a runoff election was scheduled for September 4th, 1982, between the two options with the highest votes, Commonwealth and statehood. OPI-R remained steadfast in its multifaceted approach to halt the runoff election until the recognition of CHamoru's self-determination was achieved. OPI-R appealed to the District Court of Guam Appellate Division in D.C. Court Case Number 820007A. However, the court dismissed the appeal for lack of standing. OPI-R continued its engagement with the UN. In July of 1982, CHamoru testified before the UN for the very first time about Guam's political status and openly criticized the United States. OPI-R representatives Robert Underwood, Ron Tehan, and Chris Paris Howard appeared before the UN Committee on Decolonization to make a case for CHamoru's self-determination and against U.S. colonialism. The common sentiment in Guam was that it would be the end for their careers, as openly criticizing the U.S. was viewed with suspicion. However, despite OPI-R's efforts, the runoff election proceeded, and Guam voters overwhelmingly chose Commonwealth over statehood. Although OPI-R did not succeed in their goal of limiting the plebiscite and runoff election vote to only the CHamoru people, OPI-R continued its goal of fighting for CHamoru's self-determination. OPI-R continued to send representatives to the UN, including Hope Cristobal and Ron Rivera, elevating the issue of CHamoru's self-determination and decolonization on the international stage. Through these activities, OPI-R began establishing connections between the UN and Guam, fostering formal and informal contacts, as well as networking in international seminars on decolonization. OPI-R persisted in pressuring the local political process to recognize the rights of the CHamoru people to self-determination. Its members attended every commission meeting to advocate for their concerns. OPI-R maintained that the 1982 plebiscite and runoff election were invalid, arguing that any Commonwealth Act drafted pursuant to the invalid plebiscite is also void because the votes in the 1982 plebiscite and runoff election were voted on by all registered voters and not restricted to the indigenous CHamoru's and their descendants. The unwavering efforts of OPI-R's work would eventually pay off, significantly influencing the direction that Guam leaders would take in the drafting of the Commonwealth Act. The 1982 plebiscite and runoff election results clearly showed that the people of Guam desired Commonwealth status. Guam leaders had a well-defined political objective to establish Guam as a Commonwealth, following the example of their neighbors, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. In January 1984, the passage of Public Law 1742 mandated the Commission on Self-Determination to present a Commonwealth bill to Washington, D.C. Additionally, the law required a plebiscite to be held on a draft Commonwealth Act before its submission to Congress. As such, Guam was to present to Washington, D.C. a Commonwealth bill already endorsed by the voters of Guam. During this time, OPI-R, along with other CHamoru's and allies, advocated the inclusion of CHamoru's self-determination. They also advocated for local control of immigration and restricting the Commonwealth plebiscite vote solely to the CHamoru's, among other things. The Commission made revisions to the Commonwealth draft, focusing more on CHamoru cultural and political rights, incorporating recommendations from OPI-R. One significant addition was the provision, Article 1, Section 103A, which defines CHamoru and explicitly recognizes the rights of the CHamoru people to exercise self-determination in Guam's decolonization process. Quote, "The Congress recognizes that the indigenous CHamoru people of Guam, who are all those born on Guam before August 1st, 1950, and their descendants, accept Commonwealth under United States sovereignty. The Congress further recognizes that Commonwealth does not limit the pursuit by the CHamoru people of any ultimate status which they may seek in their progress toward fulfillment of their inherent rights of self-determination, as expressed in Article 73 of the Charter of the United Nations and in United Nations Resolution 1514. OPI-R expressed concern and believed the article as written could be improved through including a timetable for when CHamorus would exercise self-determination and changing the definition of CHamoru to residents of Guam and their descendants to either 1898 or 1946. Despite OPI-R's reservations with the provision, it eventually received the group's support and was a significant win for OPI-R. Other similarly inspired provisions included the establishment of the CHamoru Land Trust, training and employment for CHamorus, an up to 5-year maximum residency requirement to participate in government-sponsored or funded programs and voting in elections and elected office holding, and a requirement for Guam's approval regarding major changes in U.S. military bases on the island. After a few initial drafts, by late 1984, the Commonwealth Act, Working Draft Number 4, was mostly completed. The draft was submitted for an informal review to Washington, D.C., and the response was generally favorable, indicating that it was largely acceptable except for a few points of concern. In order to make the Commonwealth draft more acceptable for Congress, Governor Ricardo Berdalio, as chairman of the Committee on Self-Determination, sought revisions for the act, such as deleting a provision calling for Guam's congressional delegate to have veto power over future federal legislation affecting Guam. However, OPI-R, along with the legislature's Republican minority led by Senator Joseph F. Ada, urged Berdalio not to give in, and as a result, Berdalio did not significantly change the draft. To them, too many concessions would essentially turn the Commonwealth Act into nothing more than an improved organic act, a product of Congress rather than the people of Guam. The public hearings on the draft began in July of 1985, and OPI-R, along with other CHamorus and allies, advocated for restricting the Commonwealth plebiscite vote solely to the CHamorus, among other things. The Commonwealth draft faced criticism from Washington and from many non-CHamoru residents in Guam. By late 1985, the Commission had a Commonwealth draft that was nearly complete. The public reaction to the revised draft tended to divide along ethnic lines. CHamorus tended to be strong supporters, while non-CHamorus, especially white Americans, were openly critical. Subsequently, on April 24, 1986, the legislature passed Bill 740, which became Public Law 1833. Calling for an article-by-article vote, allowing the voters of Guam to approve or reject specific parts of the proposed Commonwealth Act. The law also specified that if an article is rejected, it would be rewritten and put up for another vote. If the article is again rejected, then it would be dropped from the Commonwealth Act. The final version of the draft Commonwealth Act was completed on June 11, 1986. This referendum was scheduled for August 8, 1987. The election results showed that 10 out of the 12 articles were approved by the voters. The 2 articles that narrowly failed to get approval were Article 1, which contained provisions on CHamoru rights, and Article 7, which called for local control of immigration. Pursuant to Public Law 1833, the Commission rewrote the 2 articles and called for a special referendum to put the rewritten articles to a vote. Article 1 was condensed from 5 sections to 3, with the CHamoru self-determination provision significantly revised to the Congress recognizes the inalienable rights of self-determination of the indigenous CHamoru people of Guam, defined as all those born on Guam before August 1st, 1950, and their descendants. The exercise of such rights of self-determination shall be provided for in a constitution of the Commonwealth of Guam. The 5-year residency requirement for voting eligibility, office holding, and participation in social programs was removed. Similarly, Article 7 was revised to specify that local control of immigration would take effect 2 years after the approval of the Act, rather than immediately upon its passage. In preparation for the special election, the Commission initiated a public relations campaign aimed at encouraging a yes vote on all 5 sections of Article 1 and 7. Their efforts were bolstered by a Hunggan Yes campaign sponsored by the Organization of People for Indigenous Rights and another group calling itself the Friends of Article 1 and 7. Members of OPI-R and Friends of Article 1 and 7 appeared in the Commission's television spots advocating for a yes vote on the 5 sections. The referendum of November 7, 1987 saw a 57% turnout. All 5 sections were approved. With the successful referendum, the Commission had a complete document approved by the people of Guam, ready to be submitted to the U.S. government for approval. Despite the Commonwealth political status option as well as the draft act being voted upon by all voters on Guam rather than only CHamoru's, OPI-R became pragmatic and worked with the Commonwealth Act. And through their persistent efforts, OPI-R had a profound influence on the contents of the Commonwealth Act, as evidenced in Article 1 and 7. From the idea of CHamoru self-determination being an obscure idea to now being incorporated in the Commonwealth Act, OPI-R achieved spectacular success. Now, what Guam needed was U.S. congressional approval for the Guam Commonwealth Act in order for it to take effect. In 1988, Guam Congressman Ben Bloss introduced the Guam Commonwealth Act as Bill H.R. 4100. After congressional inaction on the bill in the next congressional session, Bloss reintroduced the Commonwealth Act as H.R. 98. A hearing on the act in Honolulu took place on December 11, 1989. Guam leaders including Governor Joseph Anda and former governors Ricardo Berdalio and Paul Calvo, senators, OPI-R members, and many ordinary CHamorus traveled to Honolulu to present testimony in support of the act. When the hearings began, more than 200 people from Guam were in attendance. However, the Commonwealth Act bill died in committee. The act was rejected because Washington viewed several of the provisions of the Commonwealth Act, such as the rights of CHamoru self-determination and mutual consent to all future federal law, as unacceptable. And Guam leaders were not willing to change the Commonwealth Act, since they argued it was already approved by the people. In 1993, OPI-R figurehead and spokesman Robert Underwood became Guam's congressman and introduced the Commonwealth Act in 3 consecutive congressional sessions. But each and every time they were rejected, not even one making it on the House floor for a vote. In the last and final attempt in 1997, the Commonwealth Act as Bill H.R. 100 received a hearing. Once again, Guam leaders, including Governor Carl Gutierrez and former governors Joseph Anda and Paul Calvo, OPI-R members, and ordinary CHamorus testified in support of the Commonwealth Act. However, H.R. 100 died in committee. The death signaled a metaphorical death for the Guam Commonwealth Act and movement. Despite the U.S. rejection of the Commonwealth Act, the ideas that OPI-R championed remained influential hereon after, even becoming public law. In 1996, OPI-R member and Senator Hope Cristobal introduced Bill 765 to establish the Guam Commission of Decolonization for the implementation and exercise of CHamoru self-determination. The motivating factors behind the bill was that it had been almost 9 years since the people of Guam have transmitted the draft Commonwealth Act to the federal government, and that Section 102A, the CHamoru self-determination provision, has been significantly changed to warrant rejection of this section of the documents. The general purpose of the Commission on Decolonization is to ascertain the desire of the CHamoru people of Guam as to their future political relationship with the United States, which would be accomplished through the Guam Election Commission conducting a political status plebiscite with participation restricted to the CHamoru people of Guam. The CHamoru people of Guam was defined as all inhabitants of Guam in 1898 and their descendants who have taken no affirmative steps to preserve or acquire foreign nationality. Bill 765 unanimously passed the legislature. However, the governor vetoed the bill. The legislature then overrode the governor's veto through a near-unanimous vote, and thus the bill became Public Law 23-147 on January 23, 1997. Within just 20 years, CHamoru self-determination went from a radical idea that the Guam legislature was afraid to support to being nearly unanimously passed by the legislature and codified in law. However, due to legal concerns about the plebiscite law being considered a race-based restriction after the Supreme Court ruling in Rice v. Cayetano, the legislature enacted Public Law 25-106, which became law on March 24, 2000. The law changed the persons eligible to vote in the political plebiscite from CHamoru people of Guam to native inhabitants of Guam, defined as those persons who became U.S. citizens by virtue of the authority and enactment of the 1950 Guam Organic Act and descendants of those persons. However, the law was challenged by a white resident of Guam in the case Davis v. Guam, where on March 8, 2017, the District Court of Guam found that the plebiscite statute impermissibly imposes race-based restrictions on the voting rights of non-native inhabitants of Guam in violation of the 15th Amendment. The courts also found it violated the 14th Amendment, and as a result of the ruling, the plebiscite law restricting the vote to native inhabitants of Guam was struck down. Guam appealed to the Ninth Circuit, but on July 29, 2019, the Ninth Circuit held that the Guam plebiscite law violated the 15th Amendment and affirmed the district court's ruling. In response to the court's ruling, former OPI-R members, now in their 60s and 70s, along with other younger CHamoru activists and groups, organized the Fanohge March, a march for CHamoru self-determination. On September 2, 2019, around 2,000 people, including Governor Lou Leon Guerrero and members of the Guam legislature, gathered at Adelup and marched to the District Court of Guam. This was the largest march for CHamoru self-determination in Guam's history and a testament to how far the concept of self-determination has come. From a relatively new and misunderstood concept to a cornerstone in CHamoru political thought. I will end with this following advertisement. OPI-R placed in the Puti'on on July 21, 1985, Guam's Liberation Day. The first sentence reads, "Kamagahit naman libre hit," which means, "Are we truly free?" With a flag of Guam flying alone in the background, this ad placed on Liberation Day provokes the people of Guam to question what freedom truly means. While July 21st is celebrated as a day when America liberated the CHaMorus on Guam from the Japanese, politically, the U.S. continues to hold Guam as an unincorporated territory. This unique public declaration was a truly radical statement for the time and showed just how dedicated OPI-R was in their fight for CHamoru self-determination during a time when many CHaMorus aligned their identity with America, and their activism came at a price. the community stigmatized prominent members of OPI-R such as Robert Underwood, Hope Cristobal, and Ron Rivera. Many people believe them to be troublemakers, racist, anti-American, or even communists. Yet, despite all the criticism, OPI-R continued to advocate for CHamoru self-determination and other CHamoru cultural and political rights. Against all odds, they made a significant impact in bringing the message of CHamoru self-determination into the consciousness of the CHamoru people. OPI-R set the groundwork for CHamoru activists today to continue the fight for CHamoru rights. If you liked and enjoyed the video, consider supporting me on Patreon so I can continue to produce more Pacific Studies content. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on all notifications, follow me on social media at PulanSpeaks, and a special Seduce Masi to Patreon supporters Puti'on, Pim Limtiaco, and Dylan Sablan. Seduce Masi for watching, Guahusi Pulen, and Pulen has spoken. Esta.